When I was a kid, I distinctly remember this photograph hanging on the wall inside my local Bob Evans restaurant. It shows a steam locomotive on what is now Mayfield Road. I was enamored by this photograph and wondered where this railroad ran. Years later, I found out it was the Cleveland and Eastern Railway, an electric interurban line that ran between Cleveland and Geauga County. Recently though, I've been pondering these two questions about the railroad. Why was it abandoned? And are there any remnants left of it today? Getting out to Geauga County from Cleveland or vice versa in the 1800s was a long and arduous task. The rural landscape was dotted with muddy trails and the rolling Chagrin Valley hills that span the border of Cuyahoga and Geauga counties. One of the few reliable routes was by taking State Road, or as it's named today, Mayfield Road.
The winter of 1876, 1877, it was warm, not unlike the winter we're having this year, and everything was mud. And the town fathers of the area, Gates Mills, what would be Euclid Township, all the areas around in Mayfield Township, everybody gathered together and said, we have to do something about this. We have to improve this. So what they did is they formed the Mayfield Plank Road Company. In December of 1877, it opened up. It was a wooden plank road, 8 feet wide, as I recall in the specs. And it ran from the top of Gates Mills Hills, where fundamentally where Hillcrest Hospital is, down to the bottom of Mayfield Road where it bumps into Euclid. And that was an 8-mile stretch. It was the wooden plank road, and it lasted in through the beginning of the 1900s, but the last planks were torn out in 1907, and it had already become pretty shabby from them. The reason it was built was because of the atrocious mud. Mayfield Road was becoming a bigger road. It had started as just a muddy Indian trail, and through the years it had grown and grown. That's really what it was to improve transportation, and it did. Once they hit Euclid Avenue, they were only going down to Doan's Corners, which is 105th and Euclid. That was the center of commerce back in the day. It wasn't the city of Cleveland. It was still in the process of growing. Millionaires Row had to be built, all that kind of stuff. So down Doan's Corners is where it was all going on. And once you got onto that plank road, you could have 2 teams of horses. You would have one team that would shag you up the hill from Gates Mills, and then you would just turn that team loose and send it on home to the barn because horses knew how to do that. And you hook up your fresh team, and then that would be what you took down the 8 miles and back type of thing. Once you got through Gates Mills, which is down and around, the hard part was over, because once you got to Geauga County and through Ashtabula County, it was pretty flat and fast, all things considered.
While the plank road improved people's lives in Cuyahoga and Geauga counties, a new mode of transportation was developing. On July 26, 1884, the first electric streetcar went into operation on the East Cleveland Railroad's Garden Street branch. The lone modified horse-drawn car was propelled by an arc-light dynamo designed by Charles F. Brush. Although its 1.5-mile run was an instant success, the operation only ran a little more than a year due to the streets being torn up for sewer work. Regardless, the experiment lasted long enough to spell the end of the horse-drawn streetcars.
If you go back to the 1800s, everything was moved by horse. Horses were slow, the roads were terrible. They needed a better way to move things, and along came the streetcar. The streetcar basically made its own road. It put down steel rails on ties and was able to go across the muddy roads like nothing. As the streetcar lines developed, they started saying, well, geez, I can connect my streetcar line with your streetcar line over here. The next thing, you got a small line between 2 cities. That's an interurban.
Street railway magnate Henry A. Everett was one of the pioneers in consolidating Cleveland's streetcar lines. In 1893, he became president of the newly formed Cleveland Electric Railway. In 1894, he partnered with businessman Edward W. Moore to form the Everett-Moore Syndicate. The duo would build and open the Akron, Bedford, and Cleveland Railroad in November 1895, making it the longest electrified rail line in the world. Everett and Moore eventually acquired nearly all but one of their interurban rail line in northern Ohio. On February 2, 1897, members of their syndicate incorporated the Cleveland and Eastern Railroad Company, later changed to the Cleveland and Eastern Railway in June 1899. The interurban route's original projection was from Cleveland to Geauga and Ashtabula counties to Orwell on the Pittsburgh, Youngstown, and Ashtabula Railroad, but this never happened. The 5 men associated with this venture wanted to build the railroad cheaply and utilize the county's Mayfield Plank Road. They applied for a franchise, but one of the county commissioners strongly opposed their requests. They not only wanted to carry passengers, but freight too, and not be restricted to carrying less than 5 cars at a time. It also stated they would have the right to use any motor power except horses. Commissioner Captain Kennedy said that if the company wants to do regular freight business, it should instead purchase a private right-of-way. A compromise was made in June of 1897, requiring them to operate the railroad by electricity and only carry barrel and package freight. In addition, rather than running upon Mayfield Road, the route would instead run alongside it. The company also worked out an agreement with the Cleveland Electric Railway to use their right-of-way from Mayfield and Lee Roads to Public Square. Word of this new venture spread quickly. It eventually caught the attention of Edwin G. Tillotson, treasurer and secretary of the Cleveland Trust Company. He assembled a group of around 20 investors to fund the project. Together with D.H. Tilden, George H. Kimball, Harrison B. McGraw, and Wyndham C. Jones, the group began acquiring the necessary right-of-way. As early as February 1898, surveying and grading of the line commenced, and by July, construction was well underway from both Chardon and Middlefield.
Constructing the Cleveland and Eastern was a daunting task because you had to run a right-of-way through areas that are not flat, so they're not meant to have such a vehicle running through them. The line connected originally at Taylor Road at Mayfield. That area is completely flat, so the interurban could run right down Mayfield Road. But once you got to Gates Mills, things became hilly. Well, there were all types of obstacles the line had to run around. So when they're looking for property, a lot of it was private property, so they had to get permission from landowners. Well, some of these were in valleys, some of them are around hills. So if you look at a map of the right-of-way, it doesn't go straight like you would assume a railroad would go. So there were a lot of bends in the track, which had to do with the topography of the land, which changed constantly. So they had to consider that. They had a lot of bridges and trestles to build over creeks and rivers and so on and so forth. They also had people who did not want to give their property away because there had been many other ventures previous to this, and those ventures came up empty-handed and people lost all of their money, including their land. So they didn't want to do that. So they had to go around these properties. One of them was actually in Gates Mills. They also had to run through a property by Mr. White, and Mr. White did not want the railroad on his property. However, he had a dairy farm, and they persuaded him to have a siding there so they could pick up his milk every day. When they got further east into Munson, there was an area that the line split. It went southeast to Middlefield and then northeast to Chardon. That area was known as the Junction. Today, people call that the Rookery because the park system owns that. That area was also called by a number of other names. There were a number of people who owned property out there. Some of them, again, did not want to give the property to the railroad, but in the end, they did. Building the line out there was difficult. The C&E bought 2 steam locomotives because there was no power out there. So as you're building the right-of-way, you need to haul equipment out there. So they used these 2 steam locomotives using flat cars to haul equipment out there. Now they built the right-of-way from 3 different areas simultaneously. The first area was the easiest because the land was flat. They connected with the Cleveland line at Taylor Road, Lee Road area, and ran it down Mayfield Road. They built simultaneously from Middlefield and Chardon westward. In order to get supplies out there, there was no bridge. So they brought supplies out on the Chagrin Falls line, which ran to Middlefield at that point. It was almost that far. So they had farmers would pick up the track in ties, so it began building from Middlefield westward to the junction. At the same time, they had farmers bring out supplies, railroad ties, rail, etc., in Chardon. And from Chardon, they built to what is again now the Rookery. When they connected at the Rookery, they continued to run south and they connected at Gates Mills, where the powerhouse was built and the car barns. Then, when that was finished, they built the iconic iron bridge across the river, which now connected the east with the west.
The last spike was driven in at Burton on September 3, 1899. The C&E line between Cleveland and Chardon opened for daily service on October 7, 1899 by Union of Electric Cars and Steam Engines. C&E had to use electricity from the Cleveland Electric Railway as their powerhouse in Gates Mills was still under construction. On December 29, 1899, the road commenced operations under its own electricity generated by their Gates Mills powerhouse.
The Cleveland and Eastern built a power plant in Gates Mills. People always ask, well, why would they use that location? Because Gates Mills is a very affluent neighborhood. Well, back in the day, Gates Mills was a blue-collar town. It was a farming community and it had 3 factories. There was plenty of land to build an operation such as a railroad yard. And so Everett-Moore built their railroad yard on the shores of the Chagrin River in Gates Mills. Gates Mills is also the halfway point between Public Square and Gates Mills and Chardon. It was 16.4 miles from Public Square to Gates Mills, another 16.2 miles from Gates Mills to Chardon. So if you're creating electricity, the further the line goes, the power drops. So you need a place, a neutral place, central place to create electricity. Also, they needed to have substations because they needed to boost the power. Now, substation is a place where they kind of rejuvenate, boost the power. And the C&E line had 2 of them. One of them was in Mayfield. It was at the location of the current Francis of Assisi's Catholic Church. The other one was at what is now known as the Rookery. But the junction, that was the second one. And they boosted the power at those locations. So Gates Mills was the ideal place to build the power plant and have the car barns, centrally located.
After the power plant was put into full operation, C&E started selling power to local residents who lived along the line. By February 22, 1900, the C&E began running electric cars to Burton and utilized their 2 steam engines for the remaining way to Middlefield since the electric wires weren't installed. The final phase of construction was extending the route to Chardon Square. A huge trestle had to be built carrying the C&E over the Pittsburgh and Western Railroad, where it then ran north along South Street and looped around the square. To commemorate the official completion of the line, a special trip was made to Chardon on June 2nd by railroad stockholders, officials, and their families. A brass band and leading residents met the party at the square, and once deboarding, they marched to a hotel where a banquet and speeches were made. With the opening of the Cleveland and Eastern, the Mayfield Plank Road was subsequently put out of business. The Interurban made travel easier as farmers and commuters no longer had to trudge through the muddy roads.
The Interurban became a source of, really for recreation is really what it started. People from the city could come out to the country and enjoy, come up through the heights, out here into Euclid Township, which later became Lyndhurst. And then if you chose, you could take the Interurban out even farther in through Gates Mills, out to Chardon, out to Burton, any variety of places, and then come back. Farmers were also hip to this, and they would put their milk cans on the Interurban, and they could ship their products to and from, and which was a very common practice back then too. So not only was it just for recreation, but commerce was an important part of that, and it just made everybody's life easier.
This was the farmer's boon, is to have an Interurban. Instead of just putting a few milk cans in the back of a wagon and traveling miles and miles to the city, they can now take it down to the corner. Just take it over to there and leave your milk cans there. Interurban will take them down to up into Cleveland, empty them, bring the empties back. In the evening, you stop at the milk stand, pick up your empties. Next day, you do it all over again.
They had a particular car, rail car, it was called Geauga. And Geauga was known as the milk car. It had 2 drivers on it, and it ran through Geauga County twice a day. It picked up 3,000 gallons of milk per day, twice a day, 7 days a week. And that milk was taken to downtown Cleveland. That's where most of the package areas were, package agencies who collected milk or whatever they had at that time. They also carried a lot of freight in addition to passengers. Farmers could use the line to sell their produce or ship their produce, not only to Cleveland, but they could transfer it in Chardon, Burton, or Middlefield, put it on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which would take it north down to Painesville or south to Warren and Youngstown. And those were the major markets back then. Before this, farmers would have to take all their produce with a horse and wagon. If they wanted to take it to Cleveland, for example, which was the shortest way to go, it would take them about 16 hours one way, which meant that someone had to watch their farm overnight. So by putting produce on the interurban car, which came right past their farm, they made a lot of money and they were able to, secure a lot of jobs, people working for them. That's why there were so many cheese factories in Geauga County and dairy farms, because it was very easy to ship milk on an interurban car.
Along the picturesque line, you could visit places like the Chesterland Caves Resort, Punderson Lake, and Bass Lake.
Looking out the window of an interurban car was an experience. In fact, just riding in one was an experience. You had the sounds, the smells, wildflowers in the spring, beautiful trees blooming in the fall, the leaves coming down. I mean, it was really an experience taking an interurban through Geauga County. There were a lot of things to see and do out in this area, and the railroad company took advantage of that. Before the line was built, there was very little entertainment in the area. But once the line was built, there were all kinds of entrepreneurs looking to build businesses, including the lines themselves. When people used interurbans early on, they used them to go to work. So in the evenings and on the weekends, the cars were empty. So the companies needed to find a way to boost revenue. And by building amusement parks, people would have leisure time in the evening or on the weekends to go to these parks. And that's what they did. So tens of thousands of people could now travel in the evening on the weekends to go to their favorite park. One of the most popular and profitable ideas they had were making excursions. For example, if it's your birthday, you can actually rent a car, call up all of your friends, get on an interurban car and go anywhere you wanted to go. You could spend the day at Euclid Beach with your friends or Puritas Park. At the end of the day, get back on the car and it would take you back home. Nowhere else could you do this. So they created their own business, which was very profitable, and one of the few things that was profitable on the Cleveland and Eastern.
To make the riding experience more enjoyable for passengers taking in the scenery, Everett-Moore created a special type of car for the C&E.
Picture window cars were windows that were twice the size of normal windows that you had in interurban cars around the country. Because it ran through some very scenic areas, Everett-Moore wanted people to enjoy their ride, because it would be a 3-hour ride oftentimes from Public Square. By the time you get to Middlefield, you spent a good portion of your day. And they wanted them to see the beautiful countryside in Geauga County. So they created a car that had very large windows, almost like sitting in your living room looking outside in your backyard, where you have this very large window. These windows were split and the windows opened, so they were very accessible to the passenger who was sitting there. So they weren't sitting in this hot car. You could actually open the window, so they were functional.
At the beginning of full operations, the railroad rostered 10 interurban cars. 6 were made by the Jewett Car Company, 3 by the St. Louis Car Company, and a Brill snowplow. Unfortunately, a devastating fire at the Gates Mills car barn on October 14, 1900, destroyed most of this brand new equipment.
The entire car barn burned to the ground. All of the interurban cars at this time were wooden. In fact, everything was wooden until 1915. Also in the fire were the 2 steam locomotives that they used to build the line and occasionally used for excursion routes. Those were melted down because the fire was so hot. There were 8 cars involved, and all 8 of them were consumed by the fire. So the company had to purchase all new equipment after the fire. The first cars each had names, for example, Geauga, Parkman, Munson, Middlefield. But after the new cars arrived, they went with a numbering system, so all cars had numbers at that time. There are many reasons why people think there was a fire was caused for a variety of reasons, but the main reason that was in newspapers at the time was because of a hot journal box. A journal box is a small area on the car where the axle gets lubricated. And they didn't have wheel bearings back then. They had sleeves, sort of. So this little box had oil and rags stuffed into it to lubricate it. And every now and then they would overheat because of friction. There were a lot of car barn fires across the country during this era because of this situation.
In June 1901, the Everett-Moore Syndicate bought the Cleveland and Chagrin Falls Electric Railroad and the Chagrin Falls and Eastern Electric Railway in the interest of the C&E. The Eastern Ohio Traction Company was then incorporated on January 1, 1902, and all three of these companies were consolidated. The combined trackage boasted a total of 88 miles in length. The lines were thereafter known as the Cleveland and Eastern and Cleveland and Chagrin Falls divisions.
By 1902, the Chagrin Falls line and the Cleveland and Eastern line were having financial issues. Although they were under one umbrella, they were two separate companies. And as companies go, management was in fierce competition with the other line, both lines competing for the same businesses in some areas. Although the ridership was different, there were other factors involved. A lot of politics comes into play here. There were also, the Cleveland and Eastern line had to support, more or less, the Chagrin line because there were more riders and more business being done on the C&E line than the Chagrin line. So the Chagrin line sort of became an albatross. You know, they had this burden that they had to help support, even though, again, it was one company, two separate companies under one umbrella. So in 1902, they had to reconsolidate, and the name was changed from the Cleveland and Eastern to the Eastern Ohio Traction Company, EOT as people know it. Though management stayed the same, nothing really changed. This was just a legal thing that companies went through back in the day. Now, everything ran fine until 1910, when legal problems again came on. There was a lot of debt on the Chagrin Falls line and not a lot of surplus on the Cleveland and Eastern line. The stockholders were very unhappy because they hadn't received any dividends as of yet, and these lines have been in business for a decade. So what happened was a court order ruled that the lines had to be reconsolidated. So on February 28, 1910, Common Pleas Court Judge Phillips ordered the company sold. So Mr. Frank Ginn and Mr. J.R. Newt, who were both major stockholders, purchased the line for $263,050. That way they could possibly receive some residuals and also help the people who had vested with them. So they took over the line in 1910. When that happened, they changed the name back to the Cleveland and Eastern, and they were back running again, just like they had previously.
While the Cleveland and Eastern Division became the Cleveland and Eastern Traction Company, the Chagrin Falls lines were renamed the Cleveland, Youngstown, and Eastern Railway.
Everyone back in the day wanted to go to Warren and Youngstown. That was the idea. I mean, they're building a line out east. There's really nothing out there, so they want to connect. And the next city to connect to would be Warren and Youngstown. The southern line, Chagrin Falls line, eventually connected in Middlefield and Garrettsville. The line ran from Chagrin Falls to a location at Steele's Corners, or in Troy, Ohio. From there, the line split north and south. The first connection was done in 1902 and it went to Middlefield. That line operated only a short time till 1908. Now, while that section was being built, the managers at Stop 58 on the Cleveland and Eastern line in Middlefield did not want that connection. Again, This was competition. They did not want to lose any business. However, there's no evidence to show that they lost business because of this. The biggest commodity in this area was the hauling of logs and lumber. There were a number of sawmills in Middlefield, including Ohio Pale, which were hauling logs all the way from West Virginia at this point, and we could get them any way they wanted, and they were using the Cleveland and Chagrin Falls line. That line failed for a number of reasons. Secondly, there was a rift between management, as I said, and they did not always want to transfer packages. The competition that they had was across the street, literally, which was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which customers would be sent over there and transfer not only freight, but people as well. Again, busiest time of year out there in Middlefield was the first weekend of September for the Geauga County Fair. Otherwise, the line did not operate very smoothly as far as passenger service is concerned. There was not a lot of passenger service out there. Moreover, when that line was built in 1902, Everett-Moore decided they wanted to take the line out. This was before it was even built. They wanted the connection to be made at Punderson instead of in Middlefield, but that, of course, never happened. The other end, which is the southern end, which went to Garrettsville, that was short-lived also, but that line had problems because there was not enough electricity out there. One of the things that line didn't have was a substation to boost electric power. The power was weak across the entire line, and often on some days there wasn't enough power to power the line to make a car run 5 miles an hour. When the interurban car got to Garrettsville, the car did not go down into town because often there wasn't enough electricity to power the motors to get the car back up the hill. If the car did go down the hill, they had a hack service next to the Parkland Hotel, which was the Home Depot there, where the line had the depot and customers would buy their tickets there. The hack service was contracted by the Interurban Company to haul the car back up the hill with their team of horses. And that happened more often than people think.
The final blow for the Garrettsville branch came in March of 1913, when a devastating Midwest-wide flood ravaged its infrastructure and right-of-way. Although the company made band-aid repairs to keep it in service, the Public Utilities Commission ordered them to replace 75% of their right-of-way within 4 months. If this timeline wasn't met, the railroad would face a major fine and be shut down. Management by this point had had enough, and on December 27, 1914, the branch was abandoned. Even after the EOT's bankruptcy and reorganization as the Cleveland and Eastern Traction Company, they were still plagued with financial issues. One of the ways the board of directors cut costs was by abandoning the Gates Mills powerhouse in 1912. Instead of generating their own electricity, they bought power from the Cleveland Illuminating Company. This was the first ever interurban line in the state of Ohio to have its electricity supplied by an outside source, and saved the company a lot of money. Between 1920 and 1923, the C&E saw a 50% decline in ridership. This was in part due to the increase in fares and the affordability of personal automobiles. The company started the bus service in 1924 called the Cleveland and Eastern Transit Company between Cleveland and Gates Mills. But this solution didn't help the financial situation of their interurban routes. It was thought the railroad could strictly rely on hauling freight, but even this didn't work due to the increasing competition with steam roads and now trucks. Beginning to bleed money, the board of directors decided to file both the C&E and Chagrin Falls lines for abandonment.
By 1921, the Cleveland and Eastern began to lose money in ridership because of the automobile and trucks that were now new. They did not exist when the lines were built. The Chagrin Falls line was actually losing money before the Cleveland and Eastern line. So they decided that they were going to close the lines down and abandon them on March of 1924. So they filed a petition with the PUC, Public Utilities Commission. The government said they could not close the line because they were operated for the public, and they also carried mail. They carried mail not only from Cleveland to Geauga County, but they were also part of the mail service people picking up mail. So it just wasn't produce, they were delivering mail. Also during this period of time, they began to build roads in Geauga County. Up to now, all the roads were dirt. There was no technology to pave roads, concrete roads. Those things did not exist during this period of time. But in 1924, those things were now coming to fruition. So between 1924 and 1925, when the line was abandoned, the government said they had to keep the line open so they could build new roads to have Red Star mail service. Now, because the roads were dirt, mail was still being delivered by horse and wagon. And when it gets rainy, the roads are nothing but mud and the mail cannot be delivered. So they want the interurbans to help bring out materials to pave the roads. So that lasted for 1 year. By that time, the roads were pretty much finished all the way to Chardon in Middlefield. Mayfield Road, for example, was not paved until the spring of 1925. So on March 31st, 1925, both the Cleveland and Chagrin Falls line and the Cleveland and Eastern line were abandoned at midnight. The final cars moved out of Public Square at midnight and went back to their respective car barns, where the lights were turned off, the power was turned off, and the lines went out of business. There were no fanfares or parades. It was just written about in the newspaper, and they quietly went out of business.
To pay off their debts, all the company's assets and properties were sold in a liquidation sale. Most of their cars were sold off, and any remaining ones were stripped of their usable parts and burned behind the shops at Gates Mills. It's almost been 100 years since the Cleveland and Eastern discontinued service. Although most of the right-of-way is on private property, you can still find many publicly accessible remnants if you know where to look. At Gates Mills, the C&E's iconic iron bridge over the Chagrin River remains standing proudly. This 110-foot-long Pratt-through truss was built in 1899 by the New Columbus Bridge Company. After the line was abandoned, it served as a bridle and pedestrian path. In 1942, the bridge was almost scrapped to aid the war effort until village officials stepped in to save it. One new piece from the Interurban is a short section of track located on the right-of-way where Stop 21 used to be. The original rails and spikes were donated by Dan Rager to the Gates Mills Historical Society, who created an outdoor exhibit with permanent signage soon to come. About 3 miles east of Gates Mills is a location of the Cleveland and Eastern Interurban Historical Society. Here you can see the original Scotland Depot, and many other artifacts are a part of their museum in the basement of the Chesterland Historical Foundation's Old Town Hall. We're now at the Rookery, a 594-acre park in Munson Township. This gorgeous landscape features a 1.5-mile trail built on the former C&E right-of-way. When you hike the trail, the first piece you'll come across is a covered pedestrian bridge built on the original railroad footings and steel span. At the site of the junction, the Park District constructed a replica station that once sat at this approximate location.
I want to encourage you to walk along this path and see the same views that people saw 100 years ago as they looked through that picture window riding in that Interurban car. You may also want to take a look at the right or left side of the right-of-way and look for concrete bases. These are round concrete bases about 15 inches in diameter that the wooden electric poles went into. Now the poles are long gone, but the concrete pole holders are still in place. Again, they're about every 100 feet.
In Burton, at the Geauga County Fairgrounds, is part of the original Burton Depot. After the line was torn up, the attached car barn was removed and the station portion was relocated and rotated 90 degrees. The building now functions as the Burton Fair's administration office. Today, more than ever, interest in the Cleveland and Eastern and interurbans in general has been on the rise. People like Dan Rager, who's authored more than 4 books on the subject and does presentations, are at the forefront of the movement in Northeast Ohio.
Over the past 20 years, a lot of interest has been brewing in Geauga and Trumbull counties for a number of reasons about rail, particularly interurbans. History repeats itself, and the pendulum has sort of swung back to people looking back to what things looked like when we were young. One of the first ideas I can share with you, is in 1981 when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad
line was abandoned in Chardon, Geauga County. Those right-of-ways have now become trails for bikes. So we have rails to trails. And people are now really starting to recognize that the interurbans and the steam lines that used to run through their areas are now bike trails. So again, history does repeat itself, and people are gaining an interest because of that. And because of that, I've started to write a couple books, and I've done presentations around the tri-state area, which get people interested. And people are interested because they realize that their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers worked on the railroad back in the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century there. And a lot of them provide information and photographs and things like that. And that has been compounded over the last 5 or 10 years. So the interest in interurban lines continues to grow. I'm not sure how far it's going to go, but I think because there are a lot of new people living in the area here, and particularly younger people who were born here, have no idea of the history before they were born, are now gaining a new experience of what was here before them. And this gives a great idea, interurbans give a great idea of what shaped this area. Because before the houses were built here, this was all farmland. Mayfield Road is a perfect example where the railroad ran right down the middle of Mayfield. There are many streets that have names of orchards or fruitland. There are photographs of locomotives sitting on fruitland in Mayfield Road. That was farmland originally, and those farmers shipped their produce via the interurban, the Cleveland and Eastern, right down Mayfield Road. So wherever you happen to live, your property, your area was affected by the interurban line.